Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Theophilus Podcast. My name is Brian Motes, and I'm your host here from week to week. I'm assistant to Peter Leithart, the president of Theophilus Institute. Theophilus Institute teaches men and women to lead cultural renewal by renewing the church. Participants in our programs will gain competence to read the Bible imaginatively, worship God faithfully, and engage the culture intelligently. On this episode, Peter Leithart and James Jordan discuss the text for the fourth Sunday after Epiphany. We hope you enjoy this discussion, and as always, thank you so much for listening.
Today we're discussing the readings for the fourth Sunday of the Epiphany season. Those are Micah 6, verses 1 through 8, 1 Corinthians 1, verses 18 through 31, and then Matthew 5, verses 1 through 12, which is the Beatitudes in Matthew's Gospel. And just to get a theme to organize our thoughts today, I want to push ahead a little bit in the Matthew reading. Just after Jesus goes through the Beatitudes and pronounces blessings over his disciples, he describes them as being the light of the world. And they're like a city set on a hill, a city of light. You don't light a lamp and then put a bushel basket over it to hide the light, but you're to set the light on a lampstand so it shines to the whole house. And the disciples are like that. And the different readings that we have in this for this fourth Sunday of Epiphany, and really the readings for Epiphany season through the next several Sundays, have to do with the church as the light of the world, and how the church is light, and how the church is to become that shining city that God calls us to be. The Micah passage in Micah 6 is makes this point in various ways. It starts with a case, a reeb of the Lord against Israel. He's calling on mountains. He's calling on the creation to witness against Israel, and he's reminding Israel of his own faithfulness to them. He's bringing evidence of his faithfulness in the Exodus. He reminds them of what happened with Balaam, and how Balaam tried to curse Israel, and the Lord turned those curses to blessings, how he delivered them from Balak and Balaam. And then he starts talking about the Israel's proper response to that. You're moving from Exodus through the wilderness, and you come to a kind of Sinai passage. What kind of sacrifice is Israel supposed to is Israel to offer in response to this faithful God? Is Israel supposed to offer ascension offerings, yearling calves, thousands of rams? Is it supposed to offer rivers of oil? Is that the kind of offering the Lord is looking for? And verse 8 of Micah 6 is the famous Micah mandate, where the Lord explains, the prophet explains what the sacrifice is that the Lord looks for. The faithful God who's brought them out of Egypt, overcome their enemies, Balaam and Balak, brought them to Sinai, brought them into the land. What he requires of them is a sacrifice of righteousness and justice. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? That's the sacrifice that Israel is supposed to offer. And as Israel does that, as Israel offers that sort of sacrifice, they become a light to the Gentiles. They become that city on a hill that's shining out to the nations. And we'll come back to the Matthew 5 and to the Beatitudes in particular, but I know, Jim, you've been thinking some about the 1 Corinthians passage and how that fits into this set of concerns.
I had one comment about
Sure.
Micah 6, and that is the mountains, the land, and the sky being witnesses against Israel goes right back to Deuteronomy. And what is read out on the mountains are the curses for secret sins in Deuteronomy 27.
Mm-hmm.
And so that again fits with this. What did God require of you to live righteously in secret places?
Mm-hmm.
Not burnt offerings and all that. So
Yeah.
I think you've got a good background there if you want to have a fourth passage.
Yeah.
1 Corinthians.
Well, you were talking a little bit about before we started, about the sequence of readings in the lectionary for this year.
Well, yeah, I think at this point it's good to know you've got 2 green times of the year if you're following colors, and green is for growth. Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man, and that's woven in as well to the various epiphanies and revelations of this time of the year. And in the Matthew year, that period, Epiphany, once we get into it, is taken up with the Sermon on the Mount, specifically Matthew 5. Then what follows in Lent and in the Easter season are passages from John, except for the crucifixion, which is again from Matthew this year. But John, since he doesn't have his own year, he fills in. Parts of John are spliced into the other 3 years, and usually in Lent and in the victory season after Easter. Then when we get to Pentecost and the growth of the church, we are in green again. The church grows in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man over the centuries. And for the readings, we have the rest of Matthew, starting up around chapter 11 or 12 and going down to the second coming, and then we get to Advent again. So that's sort of the way this year is set out, and it's unfortunate, I think, that so many of our brethren, when they get to Pentecost, they say, "Oh, I think I'll preach on the Book of Esther this season." Nah, you don't need to preach on the Book of Esther. You can teach on it, but stick with the lectionary and give people the rest of Matthew, I would say, and that's my command. So that's kind of where we are in the year, and 1 Corinthians occupies a lot of this year. Now, the problem in Corinthians, as we've seen, is people taking up sides. They're at each other's throats in terms of how things should be done. And we find out they don't have a good handle on what things continue from the Old Covenant and what things don't. They haven't come to grips with the fact that the Old Covenant dies and disappears on the cross, but it comes to life again in a new and different way at the resurrection. It's the same Jesus. We can recognize him, at least if we have bread and wine, then we can recognize him. We find out in Luke 24. So he's recognizably the same, but there are differences. So, can we eat pork? Can we eat meat sacrificed to idols? Yes, depending on the circumstances. Can we marry our mother? No. But they don't seem to have a good handle on what things continue and what things don't. And so this is where Paul and Sosthenes start in their argument in chapter 1. And let me just kind of read this over. Starting in verse 18, the word of the cross is to those who are perishing foolishness. To us that are saved is the power of God. This idea that the gospel is sheer idiocy, on the one hand, is where he starts. You guys are all idiots. So what are you boasting about? It's written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. Where is the wise man? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Now, we're used to reading that, but he goes on and says things even more radical. Since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God. It was God's plan for natural law not to work. It's the foolishness of the message which doesn't seem to make any sense in terms of Greek philosophy, for instance. So why would we expect the philosophies of man to lead toward the gospel? They lead in the opposite direction. The Jews ask for signs. Well, yeah, Moses came with signs. Moses came with an arm that healed miraculously and other things. But doesn't seem to be what's happening for us. Greeks look for wisdom. We preach Christ crucified, dead, killed. To Jews, that's a stumbling block. To Gentiles, foolishness. But to those who are called, if you can see the mystery, both Jews and Greeks citizens of the oikoumene, not Gentiles, but specifically Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Now we come to the stuff I'd like to see translated. Because the foolishness, capital F, the fool of God, that's Jesus, is wiser than men. And the weakling of God, capital W, that's Jesus, is stronger than men. Consider your call, brethren, there were not many wise. For God has chosen foolish people, foolish humans of the world to shame the wise, the fool. God has chosen the weak man, Jesus, to shame the things that are strong. The base person of the world, down at the bottom, and the despised, capital letters in all those, because they're all referring to Jesus and the people who are like him. And then he goes to the bottom, the things that don't exist, the things that are not, that he might bring into non-existence the things that are. If you want philosophical language, here it is. The things that are not, that he might nullify. This doesn't exist anymore. Now, there's a lot of funny stuff in this. We may be going too long, but I like to think of Jesus Satan having crucified Jesus and saying, okay, now, it's all mine now. And he says, but I don't see anything. There's no gravity. It's just all dark because the world has been nullified in the death of Jesus. No man should boast. By his doing, you are in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption. I'm going to suggest, and you on your own, since we don't have time to do all this now, the foolish things of the world, the fool of the world, Jesus, becomes the wisdom of God. The weak thing of the world becomes righteousness and holiness and power of God. The base things become sanctification, okay, righteousness. And then despised are redeemed. Looks to me like these things work with each other. Let him who boasts, boast in the Lord. Boast in this nothingness out of which everything begins anew. And what that means for the Corinthian church with all of its conflicts and all of its braggarts, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, and all the rest, is where he goes from here. But he starts here at the bottom line is the nothingness of the cross and the glory of the resurrection.
Well, I think you have the same kind of reversal going on in the Beatitudes too, right? Because you have Jesus.
Yes.
You have Jesus talking about poor in spirit inheriting the kingdom. Those who mourn will be comforted. It's all about the, which is emphasized even more in Luke's version, where you have the now and the future. Those who are poor now will receive riches. Those who are mourn now will one day rejoice. So that reversal is there, and I think maybe particularly the final beatitude or beatitudes, depending on how you count them, that are blessings to the persecuted, those who are considered fools, those who are base. Those are not just base, but are trampled down. But those are the very ones that God turns to, that God makes kings, that become the rulers of the world, that nullify the things that are. And I think that one of the things that strikes me about those commands at the end of the Beatitudes to those who are persecuted is the emphasis on joy in the midst of persecution. And it's one thing to be ready for persecution, kind of grimace and bear it.
Yeah.
It's a different thing to rejoice in the midst of persecution and to see that as part of the way that God is accomplishing precisely the reversal that Paul's talking about in Corinthians. It's when we share in the sufferings of Christ that God is accomplishing that and nullifying the things that are with things that are not, and things that are despised, and things that are outcast. I mean, practically, that's a real challenge to Christians to, again, not just bear with insults and persecutions, but to find joy in them, because we're sharing with Christ and sharing with the prophets in what they suffer. And that again, it's in next week's reading, but that leads immediately into Jesus talking about light. So, what is it that makes the light of the world? It's this reversal that God's accomplished, and it's the persecuted that God is. It's the persecution that God's using to turn the church into salt and light.
Yeah, I like the way you did that. You've got kind of a historical sequence in the Beatitudes, don't you? I mean, the poor in spirit are those who are going to receive the kingdom now as the Spirit's poured out. Those who mourn, and this isn't mourn over sin. It's from Matthew 23 we find out it's widows. And death itself is a great crisis. And to minimize it and say, well, this means mourning over your sins, that's not dealing honestly with the importance of physical death and how often it shows up in the Gospels. A little girl has died. Other people have died. Blessed are those who mourn; they will be comforted, because their condition is going to change. Blessed are the meek; they will inherit the earth. That's going to start now. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness; they will be satisfied. That's now. Whether that continues, I'm not sure with the other Beatitudes. But you get down to the end, it's blessed are you, of course, as everybody knows. But those things are going to come upon you, and the proof that you're getting all this stuff is that you're joining in that nullification, that going down into non-existence, and then coming to life again in a mystery, in a secret way. You should rejoice, because that's the evidence that you're included.
Right. One last thought before we close for this session. Paul's saying that the cross nullifies the world, which means that post-crucifixion, post-resurrection, those are the choices that the world is presented with. I mean, it's as David Bentley Hart put it in an essay in First Things many years ago, it's Christ or nothing. The old way is that the old sources of consolation and solace that ancient pagans used to have are just gone, and you might try to go back to that, and you find that there's nothing there. It's just it's a stark and simplified choice that's presented to the world now, because everything is nullified in Christ and at the cross.
Yeah, I think it's Rosenstock Hussey who emphasizes that once the world changes, it can't go back. Right. Once a gospel comes to some culture in Africa, you can't go back to the old gods. You either become communists and revolutionaries, which is the counterfeit form of the gospel, or you become Christians
or nihilists. Those are the options. Right?
Thanks again for listening to this episode of the Theopolis Podcast. For more information and content from Theopolis, check us out online at theopolisinstitute.com. We release new articles every Tuesday and Thursday on our blog, so you can be sure to look out for those. You can also follow us on Twitter at _Theopolis, and on Facebook if you just search for our name. We do have monthly question and answer episodes, so if you have any questions that you'd like Peter Leithart or James Jordan to answer, you can submit those through a comment on SoundCloud, a message on Twitter, or a Facebook message. That's it for now. We will see you in the next episode this week.